When Judge Sonia Sotomayor raised her voice in court, no one expected what came next, but Jasmine Crockett's thunderous reply left the entire room speechless. Before we dive into this courtroom shocker, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Union Show, and drop your thought in the comments, because this one's going to stir the pot. It began like any other formal courtroom session. The chamber was quiet, lined with wooden benches, the weight of legal tradition hanging in the air like a silent judge. Reporters were already scribbling in their notepads, cameras subtly clicking in the corners, and onlookers leaned forward, anticipating a straightforward legal exchange. No one expected the storm that was coming, not even Judge Sonia Sotomayor herself. On one side of the courtroom sat Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, a woman whose name commands respect across political lines. Known for her fierce intelligence and direct style, she presided over countless major cases, leaving no room for nonsense in her courtroom. Her voice often cut through legal arguments like a scalpel, precise, sharp, and never unsure. And across from her stood someone equally bold, but in a completely different way. Representative Jasmine Crockett. Crockett, a rising political powerhouse and trained attorney, had made a name for herself not just for her fiery speeches in Congress, but for the way she stood up again and again for voices often drowned out by power. She was no stranger to tension, no rookie to confrontation. But even she knew that facing off in front of a Supreme Court justice was a different kind of pressure. What she didn't know, what no one in the courtroom knew, was just how much her voice was about to flip the entire dynamic. At first, things moved slowly. Legal procedure, opening statements, formalities. Judge Sotomayor listened carefully, occasionally adjusting her glasses, waiting for the moment to interject. When she finally did, it came like a quiet thunderclap. Representative Crockett, Sotomayor interrupted, her tone measured but unmistakably commanding. This is not a campaign rally. Kindly keep your statements in line with the court's procedures. The room tensed. There was no outburst, no shouting, no visible sparks. Just tension, thick, electric, crawling under every seat. Jasmine paused. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. She stared at the judge, not disrespectfully, but directly. Then she took one step forward, both literally and metaphorically. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Jasmine said, her voice cool and deliberate, "my words don't belong to a campaign. They belong to every person this system has failed to hear." Gasps fluttered across the gallery, like whispers in a storm. Some people raised eyebrows. A few reporters froze mid-sentence. One cameraman zoomed in. This wasn't typical courtroom language, and this wasn't going to be a typical hearing. Judge Sotomayor leaned back in her seat, lips pursed, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak immediately. Maybe it was surprise. Maybe it was calculation. Either way, Jasmine had just seized the moment, and she wasn't done. "Truth," Crockett continued, "is not always polite. It's not always pretty, but it is always necessary. And silencing it, especially in a room built for justice, is the greatest injustice of all." Boom! The sentence echoed, not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. And this wasn't bravado. This was controlled energy, legal expertise, lived experience, precision in motion. The courtroom had officially shifted. That moment, that reply, was when people realized this wasn't just a hearing. This was a cultural reckoning happening under legal robes. It wasn't Jasmine shouting or grandstanding. It was Jasmine reclaiming space in a room where women like her were often told to speak softer, to stay polite, to wait their turn. But Crockett's turn wasn't coming. She took it, and Judge Sotomayor, despite her status, had to sit with that, not because she was powerless, but because Crockett's words carried a power no gavel could silence. Hook embedded again. "You might wear the robe, Judge, but I wear the truth. And truth doesn't answer to fear." That line would be replayed thousands of times before the day was over. Social media would grab it. Commentators would quote it. And young people, especially women of color, would feel something awaken inside them. In that moment, Crockett didn't just stand her ground. She made the ground shake. And that was only the beginning. The storm had only just started rolling in. But one thing was already clear to everyone in that courtroom. This wasn't going to be a quiet hearing. This was going to be a moment etched in history. The courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was paralyzed. After Jasmine Crockett's calm but seismic response, no one knew exactly what to expect next. The power dynamic had subtly but unmistakably shifted, and everyone in that room could feel it. Judge Sonia Sotomayor, known for her razor-sharp wit and an ability to command authority without raising her voice, had not lost her composure. But there was something different in her demeanor now. She glanced briefly at her notes, then looked back up at Crockett. This time, her expression a little more neutral, a little less dismissive. It wasn't surrender. It was recognition. Crockett, meanwhile, stood with perfect posture, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes steady. There was no smirk, no smugness, only confidence. Controlled confidence. The kind that doesn't need to shout because it knows its message is already louder than any raised voice. Sotomayor cleared her throat. "Representative Crockett," she said, her tone firm but lacking its earlier edge. "The court maintains procedural standards for a reason. We cannot devolve into rhetoric when legal clarity is required." Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't blink. She let a second pass, just enough to claim space, and then spoke. "With respect, Your Honor," she said slowly, "there is no greater clarity than naming the systems that have failed. When the law forgets the people, someone must remind it why it exists." That was it. No legal jargon. No angry tone. Just truth. That sentence sliced through the tension like a scalpel. The courtroom, still reeling from her earlier comments, now began to lean in, not physically, but emotionally. People weren't just watching. They were rooting, listening, feeling. Judge Sotomayor's response wasn't immediate. She adjusted her glasses again and paused. The silence was instructive. This was a moment of decision, not just for the judge, but for the institution itself. Was it going to shut down this voice or make room for it? Crockett continued before that choice was made for her. "I've studied law. I've practiced law. And now I legislate law," she said, pacing her words with the rhythm of someone who had walked through fire and knew exactly how to carry its flame without getting burned. "And what I've learned is that courtrooms are often allergic to truth when it's spoken by people who aren't expected to have power." Boom. Another one. Hook layered in. "If you're uncomfortable with my voice, maybe it's time to ask why the truth feels so loud." You could hear a pin drop. Then, subtly, someone in the gallery coughed. Another person shifted in their seat. These weren't distractions. These were signs of life. Signs that Crockett had broken through the usual wall of polite indifference. She wasn't lecturing. She was testifying. And it was working. Even Judge Sotomayor, behind her bench, seemed caught in the realization that this wasn't just about a procedural dispute. It was about who gets to speak in rooms like this, who gets to take up space, who is allowed to name what so many others ignore. Sotomayor spoke again, this time in a different tone. It was measured, not soft, but definitely less confrontational. "I recognize your perspective, Representative. Let us proceed in a manner that serves both justice and order." That wasn't a retreat. That was a recalibration. An acknowledgement that Crockett wasn't just making noise. She was making history. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, voice steady. "Justice and order begin with truth. I'll always make room for both." There was again that perfect balance of challenge and control. Jasmine wasn't trying to be the loudest voice in the room. She was trying to make the room hear what had never been said loudly enough. And the room was listening. Reporters were now wide-eyed. You could see them mentally sketching their headlines. One journalist whispered to another, "Did she just flip the power dynamic on Supreme Court justice?" The reply, she didn't flip it. She earned it. At this point, Crockett was no longer defending herself. She was commanding the space, not with anger, but with undeniable presence. And the most incredible part? She wasn't disrespecting the judge. She was respecting the moment enough to tell the unfiltered truth. This wasn't grandstanding. This wasn't showboating. It was what the best courtroom moments are made of: courage meeting clarity. Another embedded hook. Respect isn't something you're given because of position. It's something you earn with principle. By now, the gallery had shifted from cold spectatorship to silent awe. The balance of power had transformed, not because Jasmine Crockett had overpowered Judge Sotomayor, but because she stood so firmly her truth that even power had to respect it. And just like that, the hearing moved forward. But everything was different now. Jasmine had changed the atmosphere, not through rebellion, but through righteous presence. She didn't just answer power, she became it. The gavel hadn't struck. There was no official break. But something unspoken had shifted. Judge Sonia Sotomayor, known for owning the bench with commanding poise, had just encountered a voice that refused to yield. And instead of collapsing under pressure, that voice rose. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak in that courtroom. She reverberated. And the crowd? They felt it. Reporters lowered their pens for the first time, not to stop reporting, but to process. A few whispered to their neighbors. Courtroom regulars, hardened by years of routine hearings, exchanged looks like, did that really just happen? Even veteran legal analysts, sitting in the gallery, leaned forward, their eyes locked on Jasmine with a mix of curiosity and surprise. Because this wasn't performance. This was authenticity. Controlled, fiery, surgical authenticity. The type rarely seen in courtrooms and almost never respected. But today it had been. The energy was unlike anything the room had felt in years. Not because a Supreme Court justice had been undermined. She hadn't. But because someone had finally spoken with the kind of moral force that institutions tend to silence or ignore. And Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for permission. She spoke because she had to. One young woman in the back row, a law student, maybe, typed feverishly on her tablet. Another pulled out her phone to tweet a quote she'd just heard. The courtroom doesn't need to be comfortable for truth to be present. That was the line that began trending within minutes. But it wasn't the only one. Clips would soon flood social media. Instagram Reels, Twitter threads, TikTok breakdowns. Legal analysts arguing over whether Jasmine was out of line or if the system had finally been challenged in the right way. But at that very moment, in that quiet room, the most viral reactions weren't happening online. They were happening in real time. One older man, clearly someone who had seen decades of hearings, sat with his hands folded under his chin. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't fidgeting. He was listening, fully, and not just with his ears, but with his body. Jasmine had said something that touched a nerve not often acknowledged in such rooms. That truth and power often live on opposite sides of courtroom. And the courtroom itself? It didn't rebel. It didn't riot. It resonated. Hook layered in. Some speeches are prepared. Others are necessary. And today, Jasmine Crockett gave one the system couldn't ignore. Even Judge Sotomayor, while keeping her official tone, showed signs of quiet respect. She didn't interrupt Jasmine again. She allowed her to speak without cutting her off. That unspoken allowance was perhaps the most significant shift in power of the entire hearing. One legal correspondent scribbled a note on her pad. When the judge stops interrupting, the speaker has taken control. Another reporter near the front row caught eyes with a fellow journalist and mouthed, "This is historic." Outside the courtroom, the scene was building. Journalists were being alerted. Cameramen were adjusting angles. There were murmurs in the hallway. Someone had sent a clip of Jasmine's quote to a news outlet already prepping a breaking story. But the real movement was happening inside. The courtroom audience had gone from passive observers to participants in something much bigger. Jasmine stood, poised and steady, like someone who had not only found her voice, but had realized it didn't need permission to exist. She glanced around briefly, not out of pride, not to soak in attention, but to gauge impact. And what she saw confirmed everything. They heard her. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't grandstand. She had spoken with clarity. She had called out power, without trying to replace it. And in doing so, she had earned something rare, respect from all sides. Even those who didn't agree with her politics, even those who preferred tradition over disruption, had to admit it. This woman was unshakable, another embedded hook. They didn't expect her to speak this boldly, but the silence that followed her words said it all. A whisper from a corner echoed in the background. That's not just a representative. That's a force. And truly, she was. Backbenchers who hadn't intended to care suddenly took notes. Law clerks started typing up quotes. Interns watching from the sides exchanged messages. We're witnessing something major. No judge had been humiliated. No rules had been broken. But something much more powerful had happened. A shift. Jasmine Crockett had walked into that courtroom as a witness. She was now a voice for those who had never been heard inside walls like that. And the people sitting in that courtroom knew it. They saw it. They felt it. The gallery, for once, wasn't just watching power operate. They were watching it evolve. As the room settled into its new energy, thick with tension, respect, and realization, all eyes turned back to Judge Sonia Sotomayor. She remained motionless for a moment, hands gently clasped, elbows resting on the polished mahogany bench. Her eyes locked on Jasmine Crockett. But they weren't sharp this time. They weren't cold. They were thoughtful. This was uncharted territory. Judge Sotomayor had presided over constitutional showdowns, corporate battles, and historic social justice cases. She had handled the sharpest legal minds in the country, seen fiery activists and seasoned lawyers try to sway the court. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't trying to win a point. She was making a stand. And that distinction was impossible to ignore. Sotomayor took a breath. Representative Crockett, she began, and for the first time that day, her voice had a note of weight, not the weight of authority, but of reflection. You've made your position known. The court respects voices that challenge the structure, as long as the structure is still respected. That was a line filled with subtext. On one hand, a reminder this was still her court. The system still had rules. But underneath that, there was something else. An admission, a crack in the usual rigid armor of procedure, a recognition that Jasmine had not only obeyed the rules, she had pushed them without breaking them. And that was power. Jasmine stood silently. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The silence was louder than any applause. Sotomayor continued. Disruption is not always disrespect, she said, but it must always come with purpose. Today, your purpose has been heard. Boom. No defense. No backpedal. Just a simple acknowledgement. Jasmine's voice had not only pierced a moment. It had landed. It had moved something. In that instant, the tension of the courtroom shifted again, but not into chaos, into clarity. You could feel it in the collective posture of the people present. Reporters straightened. Observers sat upright. Even the court clerks, usually expressionless, looked slightly stunned. The judge had just done something few in her position ever did. She conceded space to a disruptive truth, hook embedded. Even power listens when the truth is undeniable. Let that sink in. Judge Sotomayor, with her decades of legal experience and unmatched authority, didn't crush the challenge. She didn't reassert control with arrogance. She let it breathe. She acknowledged what so many institutions fail to do, that sometimes justice doesn't come dressed in silence. It arrives with fire. Jasmine finally broke her silence. I appreciate that, Your Honor, she said. And I assure this court, my words aren't designed to disrupt. They're designed to remind. Sotomayor nodded. There was no applause, no cheers, but there was gravity. The kind of mutual respect you don't see on cable news or in viral clips. The kind that happens when two strong forces meet and neither backs down, but both rise. Jasmine wasn't interested in embarrassing a Supreme Court justice. She wasn't playing to the cameras or seeking internet glory. She was channeling something much deeper. A history of voices shut down, of stories erased, of truths whispered behind closed doors. And in that room, for once, those whispers became a voice that echoed louder than the bench. Another firehawk layered in. Sometimes the most powerful thing a judge can do isn't speaking, it's listening. And that's exactly what Sotomayor had done. The crowd didn't need a reaction. They'd already witnessed what mattered. The silence of gavel pounding had been replaced by the sound of understanding. One observer in the back leaned toward a colleague and said, "That right, there was justice learning to evolve." Even courtroom staff, normally frozen in neutral, whispered subtle acknowledgments to each other, not because anyone had won, but because something rare had happened. Two powerful women from different corners of the system had met in full force and left changed, not defeated. In halls of justice, most exchanges follow a script. This one tore the script up and rewrote the entire act. Live, unscripted, and unforgettable. And that's why people wouldn't stop talking about it. Journalists would later describe it as the moment a courtroom turned into a movement. Activists would clip the quotes, use them in protests, teach them in workshops. Even law students would study the exchange, not for its legal merit, but for its human power. But back in that moment, as the courtroom finally resumed its process, everyone knew they had witnessed something bigger than a hearing. They had seen a reckoning, silent, strong, and still unfolding. When the hearing finally moved forward, it did so with a completely transformed energy. The sterile routine of court proceedings had been electrified by something rare, a human moment that cut deeper than any ruling. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just offended herself. She delivered a statement to every system that had underestimated voices like hers. But the real story began after the courtroom doors opened and Crockett stepped into the hallway. Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters shouted over each other. Microphones crowded her face. Questions flew fast. Do you regret challenging a Supreme Court justice? Was that response planned? Do you think you crossed a line? Crockett didn't flinch. I didn't cross a line, she said calmly. I drew one, and I made sure truth stood on the right side of it. Hook woven in. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a correction. That single sentence set the tone for everything that followed. Clips from a hearing went viral within the hour. The moment Jasmine looked Judge Sotomayor in the eye and said, "Truth doesn't answer to fear," was clipped, captioned, and shared across every platform, from X to TikTok to Instagram. Political commentators scrambled to get statements. YouTubers posted breakdowns. Civil rights activists called it a masterclass in fearless truth-telling. Even those who didn't usually agree with Jasmine politically couldn't deny it. She had taken on one of the most respected legal minds in America and had not just held her own. She'd raised the bar. At the same time, the responses weren't universally glowing. Some legal traditionalists accused her of being disruptive, disrespectful, or too emotional for a courtroom. But those voices were quickly drowned out by others who recognized what had really happened. A powerful woman had stood firm in a room that expected her to shrink. News anchors used words like historic, bold, and trailblazing. Analysts debated whether this would set a new tone for congressional witnesses who refused to be silenced in legal spaces. On podcasts, students and scholars alike broke down the language Jasmine used. Clear, grounded, intentional, and what it meant for the next generation of leadership. Back in her district, Jasmine was celebrated like a hero. Murals were sketched. Memes went viral. College students wore T-shirts with her quote, "Respect isn't demanded in silence. It's earned in defiance." In Black and brown communities, especially, the resonance was deep. Parents showed their kids the clip. Teachers played it in class. Activists quoted it at rallies. One high school teacher tweeted, "Today, my students saw what it looks like when courage speaks truth to power and doesn't apologize." But the story wasn't just about a clash of personalities. It was about a moment where courage met history. Because Judge Sotomayor, too, played a part. She didn't storm out. She didn't escalate. She listened. She adjusted. That, too, was rare. In a system that often doubles down in the face of challenge, she let a powerful voice be heard and responded not with ego but reflection. That combination, Jasmine's fire and Sonia's restraint, created a conversation bigger than either of them. Hook woven in again. This wasn't a courtroom moment. It was a blueprint for every room that tries to silence what it doesn't understand. And while the headlines raged and the debates echoed, one truth stood above them all. People had witnessed something real, something raw, something that didn't need to be scripted to be unforgettable. The aftershocks weren't about law. They were about legitimacy. Jasmine Crockett had walked into a courtroom, knowing what it meant to be underestimated. She walked out proving that power doesn't just wear robes or titles. It speaks with integrity, clarity, and conviction. She didn't need to win a verdict. She had already made her case. And that case will be studied, shared, and remembered. Because in a world where too many are told to sit down, speak soft, and respect the process, Jasmine reminded everyone watching that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is tell the truth loud enough that even the powerful have to pause. That pause, that silence from Judge Sotomayor, that moment when tradition made room for truth, that's when history happened. And when you watch that clip again, and you will, remember, you're not just watching politics. You're not just watching law. You're watching a shift, a statement, a woman refusing to fold. You're watching Jasmine Crockett speak, not just for herself, but for generations whose voices echoed in hers. This wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. So if you're still watching, you already know this wasn't some courtroom drama staged for the cameras. This was real. Jasmine Crockett stood in front of one of the highest legal authorities in America, and instead of backing down, she stood up for herself, for her people, and for truth itself. She didn't scream. She didn't fold. She let the truth do the heavy lifting. And that's exactly what made it so powerful. If this moment hit you like it hit the rest of the nation, don't scroll away. Smash that like button, hit subscribe right now, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Did Jasmine Crockett just redefine how power should be answered, or was this a step too far? Let the debate begin. This is Union Show, where the system gets checked, and we bring the fire every time.